Let me ask you something you probably haven't thought about today. How many negotiations did you have before noon? If your answer is 0, that's the problem. Because the correct answer is almost certainly somewhere between 5 and 15. The salary conversation you're not having. The price you accepted without questioning. The deadline you agreed to without pushing back. The scope of work you took on without renegotiating the terms. The favor you did without establishing any reciprocity. Every single one of those was a negotiation. And in every single one of them, you left something on the table. Most people think negotiation is a specific event, a formal sit-down, a salary review, a contract discussion, something with an agenda and a conference room and people in suits. And because they think of it that way, they prepare for those specific moments and completely ignore the 100 other moments every week, where the exact same dynamics are in play, just without the label. Here's what negotiation actually is. It is any interaction where two people want different things and one outcome gets chosen. That's it. That definition covers almost every meaningful conversation you have. With your employer, with your clients, with your vendors, with your landlord, with your bank, with your partner, with your friends, with yourself, about how you spend your time and what you accept as normal. And here is what the research tells us about intelligent people, specifically in these interactions. They tend to lose, not dramatically, not obviously, but consistently and at scale, in ways that compound over years into enormous gaps between what they could have and what they actually have. Not because they're bad at thinking, because they're thinking about the wrong things. Today we're going to cover the specific patterns that cause smart people to consistently underperform in negotiations, and the precise shifts that change those outcomes. These aren't tricks. They're structural changes in how you approach any situation where something is at stake. Let's start with the one that probably costs more money, more opportunity, and more time than any other single pattern in this entire series. It's the assumption that the first number is real. When someone gives you a price, a salary offer, a deadline, a scope of work, a set of terms, your brain does something very specific. It anchors. The number that was stated first becomes the reference point around which all subsequent thinking is organized. This is called anchoring bias, and it is one of the most thoroughly documented cognitive phenomena in behavioral economics. And intelligent people are not immune to it. In fact, some studies suggest that people with higher analytical ability are more susceptible to anchoring in certain conditions because they spend more cognitive energy processing the implications of the anchor, rather than questioning whether the anchor itself is legitimate. Here's what that looks like in practice. A company offers you a salary of $80,000. Your brain immediately begins calculating what $80,000 means for your life, what you could afford, how it compares to your current situation, whether the benefits package makes up for anything that feels low. You are now negotiating around $80,000, but you never ask the question that actually matters. Why 80,000? What is the actual range for this role? What is the market rate in this specific geography for this specific skill set? What did the last 3 people in this position earn? You don't know. And because you accepted the anchor, you will never find out. You will negotiate somewhere between 80 and maybe 87. And you will feel like you won something. And the hiring manager will go home, knowing they had room to go to 95. The same pattern plays out in every domain. A contractor quotes you a number. A vendor names a price. A client sets a budget. A landlord states a rent. Each of these is an opening position, not a fact. But the moment you begin responding to it as if it's a fact, you've already lost the negotiation. The counter move is not to immediately counter with a lower number. That's a common mistake that treats negotiation as pure opposition. The counter move is to detach from the anchor entirely before engaging with it. You say, before we get into specifics, help me understand how you arrived at that number. Or, I want to make sure I'm comparing apples to apples. Can you walk me through what's included? Or simply, I need to think about that and come back to you. Any of these moves accomplishes the same thing. It creates space between the anchor and your response. And in that space, you recover your ability to think clearly, gather information, and engage from a position that isn't defined by their opening move. The second pattern is one we've actually touched on throughout this series, but in the context of negotiation, it takes a very specific and very costly form. It's the need to be reasonable. Intelligent people, particularly those who take pride in their rationality and their fairness, have a deep aversion to seeming unreasonable. They don't want to ask for too much. They don't want to be seen as greedy or difficult or out of touch with reality. They want to be the kind of person who makes fair requests and reaches fair agreements and leaves everyone feeling good about the interaction. And that desire, which is in many ways admirable, is also a negotiating handicap of the first order, because the person across the table from you is not similarly constrained. They are asking for what serves them. They are anchoring high or low, depending on which direction benefits their position. They are comfortable with the gap between their opening offer and their actual limit. They expect you to push back. They have built room into their position specifically because they know that any competent counterpart will negotiate. When you don't push back, two things happen simultaneously. First, you get a worse outcome than you would have gotten with even modest resistance. Second, you signal something that will define every future interaction with this person. You signal that your opening position is your actual position, that you don't negotiate, that the first number you accept is the number you'll live with. And every future interaction they have with you will start from that assumption. The research on this is striking. Across dozens of studies on salary negotiation alone, the average amount left on the table by people who accept the first offer without negotiating is between 5 and 20% of the total compensation value. Over a career, that gap compounds into hundreds of thousands of dollars. And the primary reason people don't negotiate is not that they couldn't. It's that they didn't want to seem difficult. Here's the reframe. Negotiating is not being difficult. It is being competent. Every professional context where negotiation is expected, and that is, most of them, treats a well-framed counteroffer as a sign of self-awareness, preparation, and seriousness. The hiring manager who extends an offer fully expects you to respond with a number. The vendor who quotes a price fully expects you to respond with a question. The client who proposes terms fully expects you to propose adjustments. When you don't, you're not being easy to work with. You're being easy to take advantage of. You are allowed to want more than the first offer, and you are allowed to say so calmly, professionally, without apology. The third pattern is the one that most directly connects to everything we've covered in this series. And it may be the deepest structural problem in how intelligent people approach situations of conflict or competing interest. It's the belief that the best argument wins. If you are someone who values intelligence, who prides yourself on logic and clarity and the ability to construct a compelling case, you have probably spent most of your life operating in environments where the best argument does, in fact, win. Academic environments rewarded. Technical environments rewarded. Any environment organized around objective evaluation of ideas rewards it. Negotiation is not one of those environments. Negotiation is not a debate. It is not a logic problem. The person across the table from you is not waiting to be convinced by the superior argument. They are responding to incentives, emotions, relationship dynamics, organizational pressures, ego, fear of loss, desire for gain, and a dozen other factors that have nothing to do with who made the more rational case. This means that intelligent people who walk into negotiations armed primarily with data, logic, and a well-constructed argument are chronically surprised by the results. They made the better case. They had the numbers. Their reasoning was sound. And they still ended up with less than they wanted, because the other person wasn't evaluating their argument. They were responding to a completely different set of inputs. What actually moves people in negotiation is almost never the logical case. It's the emotional and relational architecture around the case. It's whether they feel heard before they feel challenged. It's whether the outcome feels fair in a psychological sense, not just a mathematical one. It's whether saying yes allows them to feel good about themselves. It's whether they believe the relationship will be better or worse, depending on which way they move. This means the most valuable skill in any negotiation is not the ability to construct a strong argument. It is the ability to understand what the other person actually needs to feel in order to say yes, and then to create the conditions for that feeling before you make your case. In practice, this looks like this. Before you present your position, spend time understanding theirs, not tactically, not as a strategy to find their weaknesses, but genuinely. What are they trying to accomplish in this interaction? What outcome would make them feel like they won? What are the constraints they're operating under that they may not have stated? What is the cost to them of saying no to what you're asking? When you understand those things clearly, you stop making arguments and start making proposals that work for both of you. And proposals that work for both parties close at dramatically higher rates than even the most logically compelling arguments. The fourth pattern is shorter, but carries enormous practical weight. It's about what you do with silence. We talked about silence in our very first episode in the context of conversation and authority. But in negotiation, silence is a specific and extraordinarily powerful tool that most people systematically misuse. Here's what typically happens. You make a request, you name a number, you state your position, and then, because the silence feels uncomfortable, you immediately start filling it. You add qualifications. You soften the ask. You offer concessions before the other person has responded at all. You negotiate against yourself because the quiet felt like disapproval. Here's what is actually happening in that silence on the other side. They are thinking. They are calculating. They are deciding how to respond. And in many cases, they were going to give you what you ask for, or very close to it. But because you spoke into the silence before they could answer, you opened a negotiation that was already over in your favor. The rule is simple and uncomfortable. State your position, then stop talking completely. Let the silence exist. Let them be the next one to speak. Whatever they say, whatever pressure the quiet creates, your job is to hold your position long enough for them to respond. Even 30 seconds of silence in a negotiation feels like an eternity. But the person who breaks it first has almost always moved their position toward the other. This is one of the few negotiation skills that requires no research, no preparation, no analytical work. Just the willingness to sit with discomfort long enough to let your ask land. Now here is what ties all of these patterns together. Because each of them, the anchoring, the need to be reasonable, the faith in logic, the fear of silence, shares a common root. They are all ways of prioritizing how the interaction feels over what the interaction produces. Accepting the anchor feels smooth. Pushing back feels awkward. Conceding to seem reasonable feels generous. Holding a position feels selfish. Making the logical argument feels safe. Engaging with emotions feels messy. Filling the silence feels kind. Letting it sit feels cruel. In every case, the behavior that protects your comfort in the moment is the behavior that costs you the outcome. And intelligent people, who are particularly attuned to social dynamics and particularly concerned with being perceived fairly, are more susceptible to these comfort-protecting behaviors than almost anyone. The shift is not to become aggressive. It is not to become cold or transactional or difficult. It is to separate your discomfort from your decision-making, to recognize that the awkwardness of a counteroffer lasts 30 seconds, and the outcome of the negotiation lasts for years. To understand that the person across the table will respect you more, not less, for knowing what you're worth and being willing to say so clearly. Every dollar you don't negotiate, every term you don't question, every deadline you accept without discussion, every scope you absorb without pushback, is a choice. It feels like the absence of a choice. It feels like just going along with what happened. But it is a choice, made by default. And it has a cost that you will pay long after the discomfort of the negotiation would have faded. Know what you want before the conversation starts. Ask more questions than you think are necessary. State your position and stop talking. Be willing to let the other person be uncomfortable for a moment. And trust that the relationship, whatever it is strong enough to survive you asking for what you're actually worth. Because it almost always is. And the ones that aren't, were never going to serve you anyway. Next time, we're going to talk about something that might be the most counterintuitive topic in this entire series. We're going to look at why rest, Specifically, strategic and deliberate rest is not the opposite of high performance. It is the foundation of it, and why the people who treat downtime as a reward they haven't earned yet are making one of the most expensive decisions of their lives without ever realizing it. Make sure you're subscribed. That one is going to change how you think about your calendar.